Hey there, sailors and history buffs. Welcome to Boom on the Water, where we dive into the most fascinating naval disasters and triumphs throughout history. I'm your captain on this voyage through time, and I'm thrilled you've decided to come aboard. In our last episode, we watched as Xerxes and his massive Persian fleet sailed right into Themistocles' trap at Salamis. The Greeks used their home water advantage and superior naval tactics to absolutely demolish a force 3 times their size. It just goes to show that sometimes the best naval strategy isn't having the most ships, it's making sure your enemy puts their ships exactly where you want them. The Greeks didn't just win a battle that day, they saved Western civilization as we know it. Not bad for a day's work. If you enjoyed that tale of ancient naval cunning, do consider dropping anchor by hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps this channel stay afloat as we continue to explore history's most fascinating maritime moments. Now, let's set sail for today's story. The date is May 24, 1941. The place is the frigid Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. A British naval force is hunting the most dangerous predator in the North Atlantic, the German battleship Bismarck. At the head of this hunting party is HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, a vessel so magnificent it was called the Mighty Hood. At 860 feet long and displacing over 45,000 tons, Hood wasn't just a warship. It was a floating palace, a symbol of British naval power that had spent 2 decades as the largest warship in the world. For 20 years, Hood had sailed the seas as a showpiece of empire, visiting ports around the world where crowds would gather just to glimpse her majestic profile. She was, without question, the most famous warship on the planet. And in exactly 9 minutes, she would be at the bottom of the ocean. What follows is the story of how Britain's greatest warship met a death so sudden and catastrophic that even her enemies were stunned. It's a tale of bad timing, worse luck, and the brutal reality that in naval warfare, reputation means nothing once the shells start flying. Welcome to the floating palace that sank in 9 minutes, R.I.P. Titanic's meaner cousin. To understand Hood's story, we need to roll back the clock to the end of World War I. While most of the German fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow in 1919, lessons had been learned. Naval architects on both sides realized that bigger guns, better armor, and faster speeds would define the next generation of capital ships. Hood was designed during World War I but wasn't completed until 1920. She represented everything the Royal Navy thought a modern battlecruiser should be, fast as a cruiser but armed like a battleship. Hood could make 32 knots, which was screaming fast for a capital ship, while carrying 8 15-inch guns that could hurl 1-ton shells over 16 miles. There was just one problem, one rather critical problem, as it would turn out. Hood's design had been finalized before the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where 3 British battlecruisers exploded catastrophically after German shells penetrated their decks and reached their magazines. The lesson was clear: deck armor was just as important as side armor. Plans were made to increase Hood's deck protection, but in the rush to complete her after the war, those modifications were scaled back. The result? Hood had impressive side armor but relatively thin deck plating. Against plunging fire from long range, she was dangerously vulnerable. It was like wearing a bulletproof vest to a fight but forgetting your helmet. For 20 years this design flaw didn't matter much. Hood cruised the world's oceans as a symbol of British naval supremacy, making port calls from Singapore to San Francisco. Naval enthusiasts would line the docks just to see her pass. She wasn't just a warship, she was a celebrity. But when World War II erupted in 1939, Hood's days as a showpiece were over. She was now a frontline warship in a very real, very deadly war. Meanwhile, in Germany, naval engineers had been busy designing what they hoped would be the most powerful battleship in the world. Named after the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, this Leviathan displaced over 50,000 tons and carried 8 15-inch guns housed in 4 twin turrets. But unlike Hood, Bismarck was built with the harsh lessons of World War I fully incorporated into her design. Her armor scheme was superb, with excellent protection against both direct hits and plunging fire. In May 1941, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugene slipped out of German waters with a mission to break into the Atlantic and wreak havoc on British shipping. The British, having detected this movement, scrambled to intercept. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Britain, an island nation, relied on maritime supply lines for survival. If German capital ships could rampage through the Atlantic convoy routes, the consequences would be catastrophic. Leading the British interception force was Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag on none other than HMS Hood. Alongside her sailed the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, which was so fresh from the shipyard that she still had civilian technicians aboard and hadn't even completed her sea trials. It wasn't an ideal task force. Hood was old, her modernization repeatedly postponed due to budget constraints. Prince of Wales was new but untested, with gun turrets that were still working out teething problems. But they were what Britain had available, and the Bismarck had to be stopped. After days of searching through fog and foul weather, radar contact was finally made in the early hours of May 24th. Bismarck and Prince Eugene had been found in the Denmark Strait. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic naval engagements of the war. Dawn broke with visibility poor but improving. At 5:37 a.m., lookouts on Hood spotted the enemy silhouettes on the horizon. The range was approximately 17 miles, near the maximum effective range of their guns. Admiral Holland made a critical decision. Rather than approaching at an angle to bring all his guns to bear, he would charge directly at the German ships, presenting a smaller target but limiting his firepower. It was a fateful choice. The Germans, spotting the British ships at nearly the same moment, had the advantage of better visibility, looking toward the brightening eastern horizon while the British peered into the lingering darkness of the west. At 5:52 a.m., Hood opened fire. Her massive guns roared to life, sending one-ton shells arcing through the morning sky. Prince of Wales joined in moments later. The initial salvos fell short, sending massive splashes into the sea. Due to a targeting mix-up, both British ships were initially firing at Prince Eugene rather than the more dangerous Bismarck. The Germans returned fire with chilling precision. Prince Eugene's 8-inch guns found their mark almost immediately, starting a fire on Hood's boat deck. But it was Bismarck that would deliver the killing blow. At 5:55 a.m., just 3 minutes into the engagement, Admiral Holland ordered a course change to bring Hood's rear turrets into action. It was at this precise moment, as Hood was in the middle of her turn, exposing more of her deck, that Bismarck's fifth salvo came screaming in. At least one 15-inch shell from Bismarck, possibly more, struck Hood in the worst possible location. It punched through her thin deck armor and penetrated deep into the ship's vitals. What happened next was catastrophic beyond imagination. A massive explosion erupted from amidships, sending a column of flame higher than Hood's mainmast. The ship, which had been charging forward at 28 knots just seconds before, simply broke in half. The stern section continued forward briefly from momentum while the bow rose vertically before both sections sank beneath the waves. The pride of the Royal Navy, the mighty Hood, disappeared from the surface in less than 9 minutes from the firing of the first shot. Of her crew of 1,419 men, only 3 survived. The rest went down with their ship so quickly that most never knew what hit them. Prince of Wales, now alone and malfunctioning, was forced to retreat under heavy fire, taking 7 hits before breaking off the action. Bismarck hadn't escaped unscathed, though. During the brief engagement, she had taken 3 hits from Prince of Wales, one of which ruptured a fuel tank, leaving a telltale oil slick in her wake. News of Hood's destruction sent shockwaves through Britain. It wasn't just a ship that had been lost, it was a symbol of national pride and naval invincibility. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, upon hearing the news, issued his famous order to the Admiralty, "Sink the Bismarck." And thus began one of the greatest naval hunts in history. The Royal Navy threw everything it had into finding and destroying Bismarck. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers converged from all directions. The entire home fleet surged into action, supplemented by ships recalled from convoy duty and as far away as Gibraltar. For a time it seemed Bismarck might escape. She gave her pursuers the slip in foul weather, but her luck wouldn't hold. A reconnaissance plane spotted her on May 26th, and that evening, a squadron of obsolete swordfish biplanes from the carrier HMS Royal scored a miracle. One of their torpedoes struck Bismarck's rudder, jamming it and leaving the mighty ship able to do little more than steam in a circle. The end came the next morning. The battleships HMS Rodney and King George V pounded Bismarck mercilessly at close range. After absorbing over 400 shells and multiple torpedoes, Bismarck was a burning wreck. Whether she was sunk by British torpedoes or scuttled by her own crew remains debated, but by 10:40 a.m. on May 27th, she had vanished beneath the waves. The destruction of Bismarck was cold comfort for the loss of Hood. The death-toll disparity was stark. While nearly 2,100 German sailors perished with Bismarck, that paled next to Hood's catastrophic 1,415 fatalities from a crew of 1,418. The three survivors were picked up by the destroyer HMS Electra after being spotted floating in the frigid waters. So what exactly happened to Hood? How could such a mighty vessel be destroyed so quickly? Naval historians and engineers have debated this question for decades, but the most accepted theory focuses on Hood's fatal design flaw. The shell from Bismarck likely penetrated Hood's thin deck armor and detonated in or near one of her aft magazines, where hundreds of cordite propellant charges were stored. The resulting explosion was so catastrophic that it literally tore the ship apart. In 2001, 60 years after her sinking, an expedition led by deep-sea explorer David Mearns finally located Hood's wreckage, scattered across the seabed 9,200 feet below the surface. The discovery confirmed that a massive internal explosion had indeed torn the ship apart, leaving the bow and stern sections nearly a mile apart on the ocean floor. For Britain, the loss of Hood was more than a military setback. It was a psychological blow. She had been the visible embodiment of British naval might for 2 decades. Her destruction in such a swift, catastrophic manner seemed to symbolize the vulnerability of the once invincible Royal Navy in this new era of warfare. For the families of her crew, the tragedy was even more profound. In small towns across Britain, entire streets lost fathers and sons in those 9 terrible minutes. The town of Invergordon in Scotland was particularly devastated, having contributed a large number of Hood's crew. The sinking of Hood and the subsequent destruction of Bismarck marked the end of an era in naval warfare. Within months, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would demonstrate conclusively that aircraft, not battleships, would dominate the seas in the future. Hood's death was not just the loss of a great ship, but a harbinger of the changing nature of naval power itself. So what lessons can we draw from this tragedy? Perhaps the most obvious is that reputation offers no protection in warfare. Hood's 2 decades as the Queen of the Seas meant nothing when faced with Bismarck's superior design and deadly accurate gunnery. Reputation doesn't stop shells. Another lesson lies in the danger of postponing necessary upgrades. The Royal Navy knew about Hood's vulnerability to plunging fire for years, but repeatedly delayed her modernization due to budget constraints and her busy schedule of showing the flag. By the time war came, it was too late. But perhaps the most profound lesson is the brutal randomness of naval combat. Hood took just 1 or 2 critical hits out of dozens of shells fired, yet those hits struck the exact worst possible location. It was a fatal coincidence, a roll of the cosmic dice that ended 1,415 lives in an instant. As we remember Hood today, we should think not just of a powerful warship, but of the men who called her home. The youngest sailors aboard were just 15 years old, boy seamen beginning their naval careers. The oldest was 59. They were fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers who set sail on a May morning and never returned. The wreck of HMS Hood now lies protected as a war grave under British law, a silent testament to the sacrifices made in the Battle of the Atlantic. While only 3 men survived to tell her tale, we continue to remember the story of the mighty Hood, the floating palace that sank in 9 minutes. So the next time you hear someone complain about having a bad day, remind them it could be worse. They could be commanding a battlecruiser with thin deck armor against a German super battleship. Talk about a career-limiting move. This has been the floating palace that sank in 9 minutes. R.I.P. Titanic's meaner cousin. Thanks for sailing with me through this tragic tale of naval warfare. On our next voyage through the high seas of history, we'll be exploring an even more desperate naval mission. Join me for Operation Tango, Japan's suicide fleet of sadness. In April 1945, with the war all but lost, Japan sent its largest battleship, Yamato, on a one-way mission to Okinawa with barely enough fuel to reach its destination. Their plan included zero air cover and 100% wishful thinking. Spoiler alert, it did not end well. Until then, remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this tale, drop a like to help others find these stories, and always check your deck armor before challenging a German battleship. See you on the high seas of history.